Well, welcome again, everybody, to class number 3 or episode number 3 of Theories, Methods, and Other Lies. In the previous class, or in the previous episode, we discussed the delivery of your first assignment, which is due in episode 4. Episode 4 is the next episode, so you'd better hurry. I took the liberty of making a quick list of requirements so that they will not slip your mind and you will have like a small collected reminder of what needs to be delivered. Of course, what you need to deliver is a concept document, right, via email to your teacher, that is myself. And I expect that this concept contains an idea for a ludological game. By that I mean a feedback machine that contains all those formal elements which make a game, according to the definition we agreed upon. Another requirement which you should be rather familiar with by now, having met with Dan and having probably done the exercise with him, I'm talking about Turtle Attack, of course, should be that the fact that your concept document idea should be ludonarratively consistent, or ludonarratively consonant, meaning that the function and the metaphor it's wrapped within work hand in hand. There's no, or at least there's the least little as possible discrepancy between the two aspects of your game. There's a constellation of mandatory components besides, which include a cover image, an elevator pitch, and you can find all of them in the syllabus, which I've given to you. Last but not least, please strive to make the notion of family resemblances accessible and clear through gameplay. If you remember the previous class, I don't want the game to explain textually family resemblances. I don't want the game to contain Ludwig Wittgenstein or any representations thereof, but it should be the essential core of the game, the functioning of the game that forces the player to think in terms of family resemblances. Can you do that? I'm challenging you with that. So let's get started. This is episode 3, Ideogames. Probably I should read it Ideogames, but I mean, you know what I mean. I'm trying to say that we're going to talk about how concepts inside games are actual, or could be actual, bigger ideas than something uniquely devoted to entertainment. In a way, you're already doing something like that for your family resemblance assignment, aren't you? So let's keep going. Ideogames. At the beginning of the course, talking about my research, I showed you this picture. This picture was meant to show you that, at least in my point of view and in the context of my research, I do not consider traditional philosophy the one done in, say, text, or oral dissemination through dialogue, through oral lecturing, through reading of essays, is particularly separated from the way in which we build, play, understand, sell, promote digital worlds, in particular those of video games. So I see the two as being very connected. I also mentioned the fact that, or rather the idea that I consider the digital worlds of video games as opportunities to redigest philosophical past, as well as opportunities to give rise to new ways of thinking, new philosophical ideas and problems that we could not have accessed without the digital medium to play with. One thing that perhaps I didn't point out is that I'm supposing that you know the figure on the left-hand side of the picture, right? That is an iconic figure of our industry. Whereas perhaps you're not as familiar with the figure on the right, which is German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Believe it or not, this is how you write his family name. Why am I talking about Nietzsche? Well, he's one of those old philosophers, right, like you see represented in books and looking stuffy and dusty and so on. I mean, it's interesting for me as a philosophy scholar, but maybe you have seen pictures of him or heard him being mentioned, for example, in, I think, Nier Automata, had a direct mention of Nietzsche. But this is not important now. But philosophers have not always been old, boring people. As a matter of fact, what you see here is Nietzsche looking strapping in his military uniform in his 20s. Nietzsche also fought in the Austrian-Prussian War in around the 1870s. And, well, during this war, he suffered for several injuries, including one to the eyes. That injury never fully recovered, and towards the end of his career, in his late 60s, um, Nietzsche was, well, feeling sick for a number of other reasons, including syphilis, but also was not seeing very well. The reason being, yeah, his eyesight worsening due to the, well, the injury that he suffered during that war. He didn't like to conclude his philosophical production, which at the time meant writing philosophical texts. And he was not happy with dictating his work because he preferred to be the author, directly editing his text. And so his career was at a standstill until he's heard about something special. And that something special was the Malling-Hansen writing ball. What you see here is an invention of the time, which is an old predecessor of the modern typewriting machine. I think you could tell by the picture how this is working. It looks essentially like a writing machine, only the keys are distributed over something like a hemisphere of sort. There's a ink ribbon underneath it, and then the possibility to place a curved piece of paper underneath both these things. So Nietzsche heard about this invention and thought that he could learn to type without watching, similar to how you do with your mobile or your keyboard. You are so used to the position of the various keys that you do not need to look at the sheet or look at the screen or look at your hands to know that you're typing correctly. And so he started to adopt this new way of writing, which would leave him autonomous. He didn't need anybody to dictate his works to, and he could resume the writing of his text and his correspondence. As a matter of fact, most of what we know about Nietzsche's life and Nietzsche's work at the time was through his correspondence, so exchange of letters with other notable cultural figures of Europe. One of them was the German, I think he was Austrian composer Heinrich Koselleck. Heinrich Koselleck responded to some of his early mails written with his writing ball, letting Nietzsche know that he was happy to hear from him, and also that his writing seems to have changed by means of the use of this writing ball. So, in a way, even his language was changing because of the tools at his disposal for writing. Nietzsche responded that, well, he noticed that as well, that he was thinking of sentences in a different way, having to plan them ahead, and that he's probably using language in a different way, and was wondering, well, what if the use of this machine in the long run would change my language altogether and give rise to a new way of writing and thinking? To which the composer, Heinrich Koselleck, replied, well, this makes sense to me, especially because I'm a musician. When I'm writing with an instrument in mind, I am writing a certain kind of music. My brain can process, let's say, musical language in a way which is different from when I'm holding or testing or trying my musical scores out in other instruments. So it makes sense to me, in a way, wrote Koselleck, that the technical environment in which we write and with which we write changes the way in which we think and perform. This is so interesting to me. A similar thought about technology and a technical environment was brought up by Marshall McLuhan, who was a very famous Canadian media theorist in the 60s. His most famous book was published in 1964 and was called Understanding Media. Interestingly, the subtitle of that book was The Extensions of Man. Well, one of the key topics of his book, Understanding Media, was that the medium is itself the message of communication. You've probably heard this sentence before, and maybe it didn't make sense to you before, but think about this. This is what Marshall McLuhan is saying. Of course, the content of a message is important, but it's only important in the short term. What really matters in terms of long-term social and cultural change is what the medium offers. And he proposes an example. He says, take this newspaper, for example. The news that are reported in this newspaper and the articles, the ads, are going to have only relevance for a few days, right? Or maybe for a few months. But compare that, the relevance and meaning of the content, with how instead the invention of print changed the way in which we work as a society, communicate to one another, and understand each other. So one is a medium, print, and the other one is the content, what the medium is saying. He says what is truly important is the form of the medium, because that is what is really changing us. He says the same thing about television. Who cares about what is programmed? That is subject to whatever is fashionable today and the taste of the viewers of this particular time and age. But what really matters about television is what kind of means of consumption of information and communication it makes available. It shapes us, television in particular, into passive recipients of a message that was crafted for you in a hierarchical fashion. In other words, what he says is like each medium, with its possibilities, gives rise to a particular way of thinking and understanding. He calls it a particular shape of awareness, right? Which is by far more important in what we say through the medium. For example, once again, the kind of conversation you're having on your phone or the maps you're looking at right now or whatever has a limited importance compared to how the existence of mobile phones changed the way in which we communicate, relate to one another, and lead a social life. So mobile phones, as well as any other technology, set up a paradigm, a structure of awareness that has vast social cultural effects. This is almost never observed and thought about in relation to video games. We are very quick at sort of criticizing video game content because it's lewd, ridiculous, violent in particular. But we never, or almost never, stop and wonder what the medium of digital interaction is doing to us, rather than the particular content that we are angry about this week or the next week. Marshall McLuhan would call this focus on the content, like in the current video game debate, the voice of our current somnambulism. Of course, he was not talking about video games at the time, in the 60s. But this is true of every medium. As soon as they're introduced in society, we tend to be so hypnotized by its new possibilities and charmed by what we can do with it that we seem to be uniquely capable of focusing on its contents. Whereas we should try to put attention to the form of awareness and the possibilities that it discloses. Why? Because those are the things that are going to change society, not really whether you could headshot somebody in Halo 5 or whatever. If we follow Marshall McLuhan, if we want to figure out the particular ways of thinking, or as he calls it, a structure of awareness, that computers enforce on us, we might be looking at the fact that computers were originally designed to be accounting machines. So they were built to speed up calculations, optimize and monitor work tasks. So regardless of the application we're running on computers, be it Word, PowerPoint, or video games, the user of those applications or the players of those games will be invited to act according to a mindset that we can call instrumental rationality. In general, we call instrumental rationality a frame of mind which encourages us to act according to resource and quantity-oriented efficiency, and not necessarily to focus on the end of that efficiency. So it's a very process-oriented mentality that favors efficiency. Any kind of computer application you're going to be using will be quantifying and measuring your performance. And even if you look at video games, regardless of the kind of video games or platform, it could be like a console game, a PC game, or a web game and a casual game, the kind of action we're asked to perform are very, very much in line with the classical actions of instrumental rationality, which is measuring and controlling labor. These verbs are to manage, to collect, to upgrade, to optimize. Do you see that all games that we play tend to be games of performance that are quantified by computers? So there's a strong connection between the rise of automatic labor and the rise of computer games. What I'm trying to say here is that similarly to the general use of computer, the experience of computer game also set up a certain paradigm or belongs to the same paradigm. And by that paradigm, I mean instrumental rationality, being put in a certain condition in which we are expected to perform with a certain level of efficiency. This is what the computer wants from you and in any of its application, and that's particularly evident in video games. We can try another reduction at Tetris, in which we could observe Tetris according to the lens that we just presented to you. Tetris, for example, frames and rewards our actions in terms of efficiency in pursuing a certain in-game goal. This in-game goal, or actual in-game goals, are surviving as long as possible and achieving a high score. Did you notice that in Tetris you cannot negotiate your final goal? That is given to you by whoever. It's not in question. You just ask to operate in the given conditions, right? So there's also like a structure of power in Tetris as sort of computerized labor in which you are given a task and you are not in the condition of power to negotiate that task. This is super important, I think. And this is the big trouble with video games, and maybe games in general. The big trouble with video games, in my opinion, from my philosophical perspective, does not reside in the kind of content that we consume through it, but rather in the kind of thinking that they get us used to. The first kind of thinking, and I'm going to break this down in two, is the fact that it asks us, the computer I'm talking about, it asks us to reason in terms of quantities, resources, and performance, right? So everything that matters in the computer when thinking with a computer is performance, quantification, and efficiency. It enforces that point of view regardless of the game that you're playing. Very few exceptions to that. And second, it puts you in a condition in which you might not be watchful and aware that the context in which you're asked to operate is something that you can change. It in a way makes us mild and meek to outwardly imposed criteria. Let me rephrase that. It puts us in a condition to blindly accept objectives and criteria of success imposed from the outside. This is what we do when we play video games. We accept a point of view on what success and a good action is from the outside, and we are asked to perform and to perform efficiently in terms of quantities. This is the key mode of behavior that computer in general and video games in particular are imposing on us. In her 2011 book, Life on the Screen, American academic Sherry Turkle talks about the dangers of using computers in a very similar fashion to what we have sketched out right now. She believes that computers dangerously encourage people to get used to manipulating a system whose core assumptions they do not see. That's interesting, right? And we could also add they could not even manipulate or negotiate them because precisely one, they do not see it, and second, they do not have the power to do so. Ultimately, Turkle recognized those traits as an aspect of ideology. I don't know if you've heard this term before, but in general it indicates the way in which we behave and relate to the world that is provided by values that come either from tradition or from a dominant class and normally are not questioned because they're part of tradition or somebody who knows better and or has power imposes them on us. In this case, you could see that the computer is a vehicle, is a vessel for a particular kind of work ideology, according to which a good citizen or a good worker is a worker who does not question why he needs to work or she needs to work so hard and makes and considers efficiency the proper way to behave in that context. This is a picture of Sherry Turkey. She's an American academic. And this is a picture of Paolo Pedercini, who is an Italian activist. Paolo shares this vision in common with Sherry Turkle, meaning that, in a way, video games and computers in general are not neutral tools, but are tools that inevitably inject us with ideology, and that is capitalistic ideology, because they were at the root, at the very basic, capitalistic machines, accounting machines meant to increase efficiency. He wrote a very interesting essay, not an academic one, and you can find it online, called Video Games and the Spirit of Capitalism, in which he makes exactly that point. And curiously enough, he also does it with Tetris. He says a number of puzzles from Tetris onwards can be seen as an abstract exercises in rationalization. Playing these kind of games contributes to reinforcing and normalizing the value system of capitalism. I think the position should be pretty clear right now, right? They are machines that are built for and reinforce certain inscribed visions that are typical of capitalism. Efficiency, success, quantification, and so on. This is a picture of Paolo, as I mentioned before, and this is a picture of, well, you should be familiar with her. This is Janet Murray. You might remember Janet Murray as we mentioned her both as one of the founding mothers of narratology and also as, well, the author that tried to sort of like give a little context to what Tetris might mean in terms of its metaphor. Do you remember? She was talking about Tetris as something being slightly or almost entirely metaphorless, but we could try to find some like social meaning in it as its functionality is very similar, metaphorically speaking, to how we work in this post-capitalistic world. It's about the unending amount of tasks that we're given and the efficiency by which we're asked to comply with those demands. But yeah, I don't want you to think that I'm bringing up Tetris as a special case here. Nor I want you to think that looking at instrumental rationality is the only way in which we can detect ideologies in computer games. As a matter of fact, there's a number of ways in which games can influence, guide, or constrain our way of thinking, our ways of thinking. And so instead of sticking to Tetris and instrumental rationality, I want to expand this field and expand the range of my claims a little. So in looking at how video games influence the ways in which we're thinking and reflect the ways in which some of us, namely the developers in the Western world, are thinking, I'm going to propose three different examples at three different scales: the domestic, the urban, and the geopolitical. I'm going to try to show you how reality, as filtered through the eyes of games and games development, reveals certain kind of basic ideologies that were not discussed until now. Are you still following? So I'm going to look at those games as inherently having ideologies of certain kinds inscribed in them. You might think they're not political, you might think they're not ideologically sided, but I will try to prove the opposite. I would like to start looking into the first example, the one at the domestic scale. So we're going to be looking at The Sims. The Sims is a difficult thing to discuss because probably, according to the definition we decided to take at the beginning of our course, this might not be a computer game at all. It might not be a game at all. Perhaps it's easier to qualify it as um, in a way, a simplified simulation of social life of a certain kind. In particular, I mean, all of us would be able to recognize a specific way in which Western social life is understood. And the explicit goal of the game here is that of keeping your Sims healthy and happy. And so we wonder, in which ways do we keep our Sims happy and healthy? Among other things, such as the personal hygiene of each Sim. Number one, by having money, which is normally accomplished by having a Sim job. So a good life, a proper life is led where you have a job. A Sim is happy and healthy by possessing a house and goods. The pricier the goods, the longer it will keep us happy for us, our Sim, let's say. And another way to maintain happiness is by acquiring popularity. So your friends and your in-game reputation contribute to how happy and functional your sim is going to be. So ultimately, what I was talking about before, and I mentioned already, is that The Sims does not reference or simulate social life in general. This is not social life per se, but it's a very peculiar understanding of social life. We cannot decide to be a nun or a priest in The Sims. We cannot decide to live on a mountain as a hermit in The Sims. Ultimately, there's no mountains in The Sims. We cannot be a Somali pirate in The Sims. All we can do is a slight variation on what a good American or at least Western life could look like. And let me repeat to you, it is evident to me that what is represented here is an imposed version of the good life that is implicit in what the developers believe. So the developers actually built a game around what they considered or what they were thought to be a good, proper social life. When we look at how reality is mediated by games and game development at the urban level, I think that the franchise of SimCity is perhaps the most popular and better known kind of these cases. And it's a franchise that has been running for, what, 30 years or something? So this is one of the most recent installments. It's a 3D version of SimCity. Of course, there are versions that use like axonometric graphics before and so on and so forth. So they didn't always look that fancy. And I want to bring back Paolo into the discussion again. Do you remember Paolo Pedercini from Molle Industria? He was mentioned a couple of slides back. Paolo talks about SimCity as, in the way it's sold and promoted, as a lieu, as an environment of opportunities. Mostly this software package, whether we call it a game or not, I'm not too sure, is presented as a place of freedom where you can experiment with the kind of city that you want to build, right? Like you can build anything that you want to make the city of your dreams and so on and so forth. However, he claims, regardless of how you play, the game always forces you to end up with Phoenix, Arizona. The only type of city you can create, he claims, is the modernist car-centered grid-based North American city. In SimCity, you control like a disembodied mayor god or some kind of weird city management function. And you indeed have some powers to control the building of your city. So why is it that Paolo claims, well, actually this freedom is limited to a point that it can only generate one kind of city? The reason behind that is that a capitalistic Western ideology is inscribed in the rules of the game. What does he mean by that? He presents some cases about that. He mentions that the way citizens' happiness is programmed needs perpetually growing economy and jobs. So in a way, like the game needs, is meant to work under capitalism, obviously. In order to foster the development of the city, taxation need to be low, around 12%, which is sort of like the very aggressive entrepreneurial direction that some Western cultures have adopted, such as the United States. When you start to build your city from scratch and or you expand an existing city, the natural environment that is offered to the player is presented as uninhabited. It doesn't have fauna, it doesn't need any kind of protection, it does not contain any traces of other civilizations and their history. There are prepackaged units ready for exploitation. They are essentially resources, land resources, real estate units that can only be thought in terms of development possibilities. So what Paolo is saying is that SimCity, by the way its affordances are set up, encourages endless growth without confronting the player with the scarcity of resources or the viability of possible alternatives. In a famous article of his, he talks about he's trying to build communist garden cities and continuously failing at doing so because, well, simply the game is not suited for that kind of view of what a city could be. Similar to how The Sims was already encouraging and shaping a particular idea of what a good life is, SimCity is similarly shaping a certain, or rather operating under a certain vision of what a good city looks like, of what a good economy looks like, of what progress looks like. There is another interesting fact to discuss about one particular installment of the SimCity franchise, which is the 2013 one. In this version, the developers introduced a new mechanic, and this new mechanic is called homelessness. The little creatures, sort of like yellow humans with a bag that you might see, I don't know, maybe it's a bit too small in this slide, actually represent homeless people. The presence of homeless people depends on two factors in your city. The more dirty it is, the more they will come. And the less police patrol they are, I'm talking about your city, and the more they will come. So they will come from outside of the system in a way that depends on how dirty and how poorly patrolled your cities are. That is kind of interesting, right? And if you think about it, the behavior and the emergence of homelessness is not treated like a social, cultural, or rather socio-economic dynamic. Rather, it is understood as a infestation of kind. Imagine like there's no difference between how they treat homelessness and how they treat, say, an infestation of cockroaches and rats. If you are invaded by homeless people, what you need to do as this kind of mayor god, this embodied figure, is that of making your city cleaner and invest more money in policing your city. It's kind of strange, right? A friend of mine, Matteo Bittanti, wrote a 600 monograph about that game mechanics that not only analyzed how it worked in the game, but also offered on the side of his analysis interviews with the developers. In the book, he shows that the developers themselves don't see a problem with how homelessness is treated. That is, not a socio-economic problem that could be solved by a different political agenda in town, but as a sort of like pest, right? And he proves that through interviews that the developers themselves are sort of blind to the ideologies that they themselves hold. So probably people at Maxis in San Francisco consider homeless to be something that comes from somewhere. Homelessness as something that is generated by dirt and that should be probably chased away by police because, as you can understand, it makes city living less clean, less safe, less comfortable, and probably it decreases the value of real estate. That mechanic according to which the presence of homelessness also influences the price and the value of the city is reflected in the game. And so by now, I hope you understand what I mean when I say that there's big trouble in the way that we currently use and understand computer games. It is largely a matter of the affordances and how the game interactions are set up, rather than what the games talk about. It's not important if we talk about war or a city, if the kind of affordances shape up our ways of thinking and acting within those worlds in a particular fashion. Let me simplify this idea for you. I think that the big trouble with computer games is that if we play those games not critically, and not only those games, but any games basically not critically, video games contribute to reinforcing and normalizing certain ideologies, which normally are either imposed by tradition, the state, law, or simply by my own beliefs as an individual, such as I don't like homelessness and I don't care where they're coming from. So we looked at two aspects of how ideologies about the real world can, in a way, percolate into game worlds. And we did it at two different scales. We look at society at the domestic level in The Sims, and the urban ways to look at society again and city in SimCity. Only one little step is missing in the simplified analysis that I'm offering in this class, which is the geopolitical level. In discussing this third and last layer of my analysis, the geopolitical one, I'm going to look at a game called Civilization, which, similar to SimCity, is a video game franchise that has been discussed, played, promoted, and so on for decades. The reason why I'm picking Civilization 2 in particular is that an academic called Ted Friedman used it to illustrate his points about inherent ideologies in video games. Before we continue, I would like to point out that Civilization is a game that, again, allows you to play a disembodied, undying leader that falls under what is informally called the 4X game genre. In case you didn't know, 4X stand like for the kind of activities that are pursued in these games and similar kinds of games, which is explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. So you get an idea of what kind of instrumental rationality is chiefly and constantly at play in these games. So according to Ted Friedman, civilization relies on a dangerous myth, which is that of endless resources and perpetual economic growth, which culminates in the space age. In a game of Civilization 2, the goal is to develop your culture and your civilization enough so that you can leave the planet. So you will need to actually wage war and consume resources and develop your technology to a point that you can eventually leave here. In the game, global politics is presented as a matter of competition and domination. It's always win or lose. There's no compromise and there's no alliance. There's no indication that sustainability might be a point of interest. As a matter of fact, like the goal here is to be the first one and the only one to leave for space and leave everybody else in the dumpster. According to how the game is programmed, no form of geopolitical organization exists after the rise of nationalism. The game asks you to control a prehistoric group of people and guide them through the ages of history and the relative political developments, but suddenly stops when it reaches the current state of geopolitical organization, so that we can pat ourselves on the back and say, well, we're part of the end of history and there's nothing beyond us, and there's even no reason to fantasize or try to imagine how we could restructure or organize ourselves in other ways, which is a big shame, isn't it? In this case, video games are not used as tools to fantasize and to expand our capabilities of thinking about possibilities, but rather to, in a way, restrict us to what already happened. In the game, you do not see physical representations of violence, and the death counts and the number of people dying for diseases are just numbers on your screen. So, according to Ted Friedman, abstraction and depersonalization in a way negate the fact that, or at least hide the fact that colonization and conquest are essentially acts of violence against other people. In the game, art, architecture, and religion serve a purely functional role, which is that of pacifying. Do you remember in The Sims where you would be kept happy by your possessions, by paintings or swimming pools? The same happens in Civilization, where when your population is in a state of unrest, you can calm them down by building um, structures that are not necessarily functional, by providing them with spectacles and art and so on and so forth. So the cultural function of art here, and maybe video games even, is again not that of stimulating new and potentially useful ways of thinking, but rather to be something that is secondary at the service of power, at the service of the status quo. In Civilization, there is no mixing of cultures and races. There is no creolization. And one cannot play, at least in Civilization 2, minority, nomad people, or diasporic people. The impossibility to play minorities or oppressed people was eventually rectified in 2016 with Civilization number 6. In one of the expansions, you are, as a player, given the possibility of taking control over the Aztecs, for example. The problem here is that the Aztecs would also still function according to the mechanics of the game, meaning that regardless of the fact that you are a highly religious, sacrifice-based, myth-infused culture, does not stop you from wanting, at least fictionally in the game, to develop into a technological superpower. So you cannot decide to play Civilization as an Aztec unless you decide to play Civilization as an Aztec as a subpar choice to become a capitalistic superpower. The same happens with another expansion, which is the Cree Nation, which was a group of Native Americans which inhabited part of northern United States and part of Canada. Again, you would be able to take control over the Cree Nation only to take it, to be able to be successful in the game, to the point in which it can compete against, say, Europe, the Germans, and so on and so forth. Recently, one of the elder people of the Cree Nation, named Milton Tutusis, was interviewed and said in the interview that this game in particular perpetuates the myth that indigenous people had similar values and, of course, intentions as the colonial culture. And he insists that this is not even a thing with video games alone. Hollywood has done a job for many decades, he said, of portraying indigenous people in a certain way that has been very harmful. So let me repeat to you that I see a big trouble in taking these games as at face value and not asking ourselves why the games that we mentioned, as well as many others, are forcing us to behave in certain ways, to understand success in a certain way, to metabolize conflicts in a certain way. But I also would like to point out that this is not just bad news for us. Because if we realize that games can change or in a way can reinforce certain ways in which we think, then there's also a possibility for us to change how we use this technology and maybe to think differently through games. According to Paolo Pedercini, which we mentioned several times during this class, we are currently, in these very years, I think this interview of his was given 2 years ago, in a slow and collective process of hacking what were originally accounting machines into expressive machines. And this is a slow and collective process. But what he says is that we should not be just happy with how we're interacting with computer games and how, say, money, big corporations and big productions want us to think about capitalism, but perhaps there is some ways in which indie game production can, in a way, favor and foster new ways of thinking about possibilities, societies, and how we relate to one another. Paolo from Molindustria, in fact, made games himself that are of this critical kind. For example, iPhone Story was a video game that, in a way, showed you while playing how the very phone on which you're playing the game was constructed, where the raw materials came from, and who was actually exploited in terms of labor for the construction and the cheap reproduction of this technology that we take for granted. So again, this was not a technology of obfuscation of how the system is working and how money and power are shaping the world in which we live, but a game that was supposed to, in a way, open our eyes to how that is happening. He also wrote a very famous game that I'm linking in the information I'm sending together with this class called the McDonald's game. In many of his games, you're put in the condition of somebody who's exploiting somebody else or is doing evil for some kind. And you are shown how and why you might be, in a way, encouraged or ending up in a position of doing evil without necessarily realizing that you're doing evil. Another game that, for example, takes that perspective is We Become What We Behold by Nikki Case. She's a super talented, I think, Canadian developer who makes small free games to highlight social and philosophical issues. In this case here, We Become What We Behold is about the power of media and mass media in terms of how we think about news and events that happen in the world. I really recommend that you try to play all of these short and provocative little critical games. Do you understand that I'm calling them critical? Because precisely they are meant to stimulate non-conventional thinking about certain things that, in a way, we normally take for granted or take at face value in everyday life. I myself make those kind of games normally with philosophical themes. And the last two I made are Something Something Soup Something and a game called Here, the video game. So I'm also contributing in trying to use game mechanics and computer interactions in a way that does not favor capitalism, does not favor a blind approach to the status quo, but in a way encourage rethinking our relationship with the world, with money, with society, and with one another. I really encourage and hope that playing this game and listening to this class will change the way in which you maybe face the responsibility of being a game developer or even a game designer. In Something Something Soup Something, which is one of the two games that I showed you now, the point here is to help us think how we think, especially how we think in terms of categories. This is a screenshot of the game that I, once again, encourage you to play and maybe discuss with me on occasions when we will talk live, such as Thursdays at noon in the current class. I will not spoil you how the game works. Actually, in a general class, I would probably talk about it, but I'd rather you played it before and then tell me what you think. Another point that is dear to my heart is the fact that, well, actually, we're going to be discussing this in a particular class at the end of the block. The class is going to be called Doing Culture with Video Games, and essentially I'm going to talk about a few of those things. So perhaps I shouldn't spoil it, but all I'm trying to say here is that I don't think video games by themselves are the ultimate tools for doing culture or criticize society. And I myself, as well as all the other people that I mentioned already, such as Paolo from Industria, Nikki Case, and so on and so forth, they also write about their experience. So video games is part of a larger communication strategy that also takes place in the form of blogs, texts, videos, or why not, academic articles. And also, I'm not by myself in doing games that are specifically about philosophy. My friend Pippin Barr tends to do them as well. In this case, you see like ancient Greek punishments made interactive in stupid, little, interesting, fascinating games by Pippin. Let's get to the conclusions of this first part of the class. Conclusions which I consider extremely, extremely important. To me, this is the core of the course that I'm teaching today. And the core is that I think we can and probably should focus on crafting digital spaces and virtual experiences that help reveal and demystify dominant ideologies. Not games that reinforce and blind us to them, but games that allow them to come to the surface and be visible and be manipulable. We can and probably should focus on crafting virtual interaction that promote critical thinking rather than constituting obstacles to it. In this way, we're going to be truly servicing society rather than, again, servicing entertainment or big corporations that want to make money with funny, interesting, non-actual digital interactions. So what I'm trying to get to is that we can and probably should understand computers as tools that can encourage active ways to understand and imagine our collective futures. This is so crucial to me that if there's one thing that I want you to take away from the entirety of the course that I'm teaching, is this last sentence. So I'm guessing we should take a pause right now. I'm getting a bit tired and, as you probably understood, also a bit worked up with what we're currently doing with computer games. So I'll take 5 minutes and maybe you take the same. The part that follows is loosely connected with what we talked about. So perhaps it's also nice to conceptually have a little break. Hey, welcome back. We will begin the second half of this class in a fairly traditional way, meaning by looking again at the analytical definition that I decided to offer at the beginning of this course to guide the progress of the module. As I promised also, during the course of the module itself, we will go through each and every one of those elements by focusing our designer's attention on them. Today, in particular, we will look at one of them, boundaries. In design studies and game studies, we normally recognize four types of world boundaries or spatial boundaries to our games. We can talk about soft boundaries, and if you're familiar with Halo or Journey as the two games that I bring up here as examples, you might remember that those are, in a way, areas that are not hard bounded. So they're not like impossible to enter, if you will, but areas of transition between being within the game and outside of the game. You can swim in Halo for a very brief period of time before the game forces you back with a countdown into a acceptable combat area. In Journey, you can definitely decide to walk astray from the intended path that the designers put in front of you as a player, but after a while, like the wind will grow in intensity. Remember that in Journey, like the game is set in a desert most of the time, or in ruins that take place in a desert. So if you go outside of the intended area, you will be pushed back in a sort of like, oh, there's a windstorm or a sandstorm, and your character is gently pushed back into acceptable parts or playable parts of the level. So they're not hard boundaries like the ones that will follow, but still, they are transitional areas that in a way will give you time to go back to the intended use of the level. As I was mentioning, the second voice, the second item on this list, is a hard boundary or a set of hard boundaries. You might be familiar in games with hard boundaries metaphorized as, say, walls, cliffs, barriers of different kinds, especially in old games, but still in modern games as well. Think about, I don't know, I'm thinking um, Skyrim and even in Sekiro, for example, to talk about a very recent release, we still find invisible walls, meaning that a certain part of a level or a certain part of the world is bounded in a way that does not look or is not metaphorized as a boundary, but is still impassable for the player. I mean, the joke on invisible walls is a long one in the games industry tradition. There are games that offer no boundaries, but rather they continue to create content on the fly, that is, procedurally via algorithms and basic forms of artificial intelligence, so that you could extend your play in whatever direction you want to extend your play. Examples of these are, for example, No Man's Sky and EVE Online, where the players can definitely move outside of the pre-designed or the pre-discovered part of space, only to find more space with similar or combinatorially similar characteristic as the game space that we've already visited. Another version of the no boundaries possibility is what is called, in according to mathematical lexicon, a periodic boundary condition. By that we mean that the game actually works as a wraparound geometrical surface that can be exited from one side and re-entered from the other. Sometimes you talk about these worlds like wraparound worlds or what do you call, like, well, I mean, worlds without boundaries, but the technical term here is periodic boundary condition. You have one of those in, say, um, Space Wars, in Asteroids, in Pac-Man. This is quite typical of the 80s arcade games, and recently casual games have borrowed some of those approaches to limitations. So you might have a periodic boundary condition just on the top and bottom border, or a periodic boundary condition on the left and right border, or on all borders, right? Super Mario Galaxy, if you think about it, might be a clever example of a 3D periodic boundary condition ruled world. So let's see what's next. Ah, yeah, of course. The ideological positioning of how we use these boundaries and how we limit player behavior spatially is discussed in a beautiful article that I want you to read, and it's going to be one of the must reads for this episode, which is called Invisible Walls, Puffy Clouds, and the Unheavenly Worlds Behind Them. It was written by Paolo Pedercini, whom I mentioned very, very often in this class. This is a Paolo heavy class. Do you remember the designer for Molla Industria, the activist game designers from Italy now living in Pittsburgh? So, to summarize the conceptual steps we have taken since the beginning of the course, I would like to point out that in apart from looking at games from the entertainment perspective, as in like how can we achieve this very fleeting and controversial idea of fun, we looked at games as logical tools, right? As sort of feedback machines that quantify certain outcomes and push players to achieve certain levels of efficiency. We mostly focus on this very functional, formal vision in episode 1. In episode 2, which was the last class, we also looked at how these functional capabilities of games, these functional core behaviors of games, match or do not match with the way in which the games are presented from a narrative and aesthetical perspective. So we started to talk about ideas like ludonarrative consistency, right? So we looked at them as functional objects, as objects that can be understood together with their metaphorical meanings. And currently, now in this class, we started to look at them as objects which have meanings that emerge from the limitations and the affordances that these objects have, the boundaries and the possibilities that are offered within it. This is why I thought it was interesting to talk about boundaries today. If you're interested in boundaries in particular, a recent book by a good friend of mine, Riccardo, he will also come back in our class, is called Every Game is an Island, Ending and Extremities in Video Games. He takes a media studies approach to computer games, particularly focusing on the meaning and on the functions of the endings, limitations, boundaries, and so on and so forth. If this is an interesting part of the class for you, I definitely recommend you to pick up this book. Similar to Riccardo, the author of the book that I just mentioned, Ian Bogost also likes to talk about the limitations and affordances of video games as expressive tools, as as context where meaning emerges in games. He in fact claims that video games can, and in fact do, simulate complex situations that invite players to reflect on different courses of action. And what is left out of these complex simulations constitutes the designer's more or less conscious ideological positioning. What he's saying here is that computer games, partly, if not mainly, generate and communicate meaning by the way they are constrained technically. When he talks about the ideological positioning of the designer, he's talking about what the designer decides to make part of this simulation and how the designer decides to put limits to this simulation. I mentioned what an ideology is before in the class, but I think it's maybe important to repeat it now. An ideology is a system of beliefs that constitute one's goals and determines one's actions. For example, the game designer's decision. Ideologies are, in this sense, ideas accepted and proposed by the dominant class or class of power of, for example, game designers again, and they are shared by its members, for example, the players, in often implicit ways. Jesper Juhl, whom we met before in 2 occasions, one talking about a formal definition of games, and 2 as the author of Zero Player Games. Do you remember the 2012 paper that I asked you to read in the first class? Well, he also presents a point of view that is very similar to what Bogost just said. And he also talks about the limitations and what is left out from a certain simulation or systemic representation of something as something extremely important in terms of the expression, of the meaning that the game will have. According to Jesper Juhl, in fact, all open-ended games, and open-ended games in particular, but that is not only true of open-ended games, establish a path of least resistance. By that, he means that a designer, in a way, favored by means of rewards or ease of traversing a certain environment, the game designer favored and intended a particular use of video games that make your progress easier. Deciding not to follow that path laid in front of the player is a way for the player to reveal the game's underlying ideologies. By trying to go your own way or to counter what is expected of you, the game will respond in interesting ways that reveal how it's built and why it's built in a certain way. And this is a picture of academic Mary Flanagan, whose views on subversive play and going against the grain of a particular game is very similar to Jasper Jewell and one of the core interests of her work as an academic. In 2009, she wrote a book called Critical Play Radical Game Design, in which she focuses on the historical traces of players rebelling against a certain design or designer's view, and in a way making culture by repurposing a functioning of a game. It's very interesting, right? It's very interesting, this idea that a game can become a cultural tool not only by adapting and accepting its rules and sticking to its limitations, but by also um, countering those limitations, expanding those boundaries, and playing against the way the game was supposed to be played. If you're into subversive play and counterculture, this might be an interesting book for you. Maybe this is interesting for your thesis. I don't know. I'm going to show you an example of what I mean by subversive play and the cultural value of subversive play. The first example that I want to bring to your attention is the story of Alice and Kev. What is the story of Alice and Kev? Alice and Kev is the title of a blog by Robin Birkinshaw, a British player who decided to go against the intended behavior and the intended functioning of a game called The Sims 3. If you remember the earlier part of the class, we looked into how The Sims 3 is intended to play and the way in which the game encourages you to understand a good life for your Sims. So instead of going for wealth, popularity, and material possessions, Robin Birkinshaw decided to make his Sims miserable, homeless, and without any possessions. And he's, in a way, kept recording his progresses in what the game did to counter this ambition of his. So Alice and Kev, the story of being homeless in The Sims 3, is the name of a blog detailing the results of an experiment by, as I said, Robin Birkinshaw. He deliberately tried to make his Sims homeless and miserable. Birkinshaw says, I created two Sims, moved them into a place made to look like an abandoned park, removed all of their remaining money, and then attempted to help them survive without taking any of the game's unrealistically easy cash routes. If you're interested to know how that went, you can follow Robin Birkinshaw's blog. However, you must understand that the game was not originally intended to behave that way, and in fact, a number of fail-safes kept trying to kick in to, in a way, recover Robin from his wrong playing of The Sims 3. That's pretty interesting, right? It's like exerting a sort of subversive reaction or resistance to power. In this case, the power is the ideologies of what a good life is imposed by the designers. So what Mary Flanagan, but also Robin Birkinshaw, are bringing to the surface here is that exploring the limit of a simulation is an expressive cultural act, and according to Mary Flanagan, this act has a long tradition. In the case of Alice and Kev, it was a rebellion against the restrictive capitalistic orientation of The Sims 3. And there are clearly other ways to play with style, meaning I will talk about what it means to play with style. Think of example of pacifist runs. When I mean to play with style, I'm saying playing with more restrictive kinds of behavior than originally offered by the game. But we will talk about that in the next class, so don't panic for now. So there are games like Halo, in which the narrative premise says that you've been invaded or a great danger is looming over the entirety of life in the galaxy. And you're given control over a genetically engineered space marine who essentially can wield guns or his bare hands to solve issues. So the game, of course, both through narrative, aesthetics, and by the very affordances that are offered to the player, that is, you can only wield guns and jump and run, is inviting the player to solve the situation with violence. So some players, and you can find essentially an account of almost any shooting game by now that can be played in a pacifist run or quasi-pacifist run. So the players decided to try to play it without exerting violence, and which revealed that in some occasions this was possible. Some versions of Halo you need to shoot at least a couple of baddies down to be able to finish the game. But again, you understand the game was not necessarily supposed to be played that way. It's not inviting the players to play that way. And so by trying, we reveal what is actually hidden, what the game secretly wants from us. Originally, this idea of aesthetics run or pacifist runs, as I mentioned, were a bit like punk rock and roll. This is a picture of the band Converge, by the way. In the sense that the developers were not in on the joke. The developers made games to be played in a certain way, and players decided to make these games their own by playing against the grain and using it as a rebellious exploratory action. However, today, playing those kind of aesthetic, stylish runs is no longer like punk rock anymore. It's more like, well, Green Day. Well, what I mean to say is that is no longer this sort of rebellious, revolutionary cultural act, but it's an activity that is now part of commercial games. It's something that most commercial games embrace, reward, encourage. Think, for example, of the Fallout series. You can reach a number of perks and orientations depending on what you decide to do. For example, as you can see in this Pip-Boy counter, the player in question, this is not me, but still, killed 0 people and 0 creature almost at the end of the game. Like this person discovered 109 location and completed 50 quests. As a matter of fact, because of that, the player got a particular, I wouldn't say reward but outcome from the player, which is a badge called Friend of the People, and it's the extreme version of the good alignment, so to speak. Other games similarly afford a number of different possible ways to solve issues, traverse levels, complete quests. I'm thinking about the Dishonored one as a particular evident one, in which you can decide to finish the game without exerting any violence, but using magic, without exerting any violence, without using magic, using both, using none, and so on and so forth. So the game is actually much more flexible than, let's say, the way in which we used to do game design 10, 15 years ago. And well, it's really up to you whether you consider this to be a positive thing, meaning that the games are more flexible, more accessible. They allow a number of experiments and explorations that were not possible to begin with. But at the same time, there's also this, in a way, taking over of rebellious positions that the industry is imposing on the players, meaning that it's harder and harder for players to decide to, in a way, counter or play outside of the intended scope of a video game. So let me repeat. On the one hand, this is definitely a positive thing because games are more replayable, more accessible, more interesting in a number of different ways. But at the same time, this movement is also disempowering players that wanted to, in a way, play outside of the possibility of the game. I already told you about a particularly interesting paper, in my opinion, that is the detailing of how the game reacted, and I'm talking about Zelda Breath of the Wild here, to being played in a vegan way. If you're interested, ask me for this paper, and I'll be happily giving it, and I will be happily giving it to you. In which way is this interesting? Well, it depends. Maybe your final thesis is going to be about some degree of subversion or the removal of possibilities of subversion in games. Also, you need to understand that if you leave all of these avenues open to your players, inevitably part of the message that you're sending as a designer, such as, for example, well, this is a struggle that can only be solved with violence, or killing a number of people is necessary to, or animals is necessary to reestablish the balance in the world. Those are necessary sacrifices that you're willing to do as the hero of time or as the Spartan super soldier that you are. So, in a way, like by making a number of routes available to your players, you inevitably also water down your possibility to send a univocal message with your work. Which is also why possibly artistic games, independent games, um, authorial games, games for politics, games that support a certain social message tend to be a lot shorter and a lot less free. I will ask you to play one of these games, one of these political games, and you will notice how the restrictions that are imposed on you as a player are a definite part of the message and the meaning that the game is trying to convey. Another example, just for fun, that I would like to mention of subversive play consists in playing under the permadeath condition. Meaning that players decide to keep playing the same character until this character dies once, and after that, the character is abandoned. You can understand that this is particularly difficult in games such as Dark Souls or even like the Bethesda games, because death is always lurking. You might always end up in an area, if you don't know the game well enough, where you need to fight bosses and enemies that are not within your expected level of skills. So, which makes the player question the meaning and the reversibility of in-game actions and choices. People who decide to play this way do not only do it for the thrill of being always at the verge of dying and restarting and resetting their progress, but it's also about the fact that these players tend to understand traditional gaming and choices and gameplay in traditional gaming as too lenient. Death is almost trivialized by contemporary gaming in a sense that it's just a um, minor setback, a trivial annoyance. Whereas they want to, in a way, get back the gravitas, the well, I cannot think of a different word, the heavy weight of death back into their hands and decide that this game will be played as if this person, this avatar, this virtual person was me. And so I only get one chance to make this game right. So in a way, it's taking back power and meaning from a game that they perceive having lost meaning and importance because of the triviality of failing and trying again. Some former students of mine also decided to play Skyrim without fast transportation, or the Dark Souls as well without fast transportation. What that means is that you will need to traverse the world, regardless of how big that is, always in real time, enduring all kinds of weather, all kind of meteorological transitions, seasons, long hours of riding horses, and so on and so forth. Similarly to the permadeath condition, this way of relating to the game is in a way a reaction towards the triviality of traversing space that many of these games, for the sake of convenience, afford their players. They understand that this is a possibility that they have. If I feel like, if I felt like, I could fast travel, but that would in a way trivialize my experience of going through this giant, beautiful world. It will make my experience less realistic in a sense. You might recognize this face. We brought him up once or twice in the first two classes. In case you don't remember the name, you might want to because his papers are very, very influential in game studies. His name is Espen Aarseth, and he talked about expressive play in a very famous paper of his published in 2007 called I Fought the Law. In that paper, he says that games rule us and constrain our behavior. We, as players, are only half ourselves when we play by the rules or as intended by the game. In that paper, called I Fought the Law, as I said, Arset continues by saying that those acts of transgressions are wondrous acts that remind us, similar to like what modernism did in the arts, right? They reminded us that things could be otherwise, that we could take back power, that we could fight for a different world. So he said that those acts of transgression remind us that it's possible to regain control, however briefly, and to dominate that which dominates us so completely. So he even says that, well, transgressive play has an inherent political power. It empowers the player that decides to go against it to articulate and assess a possibility for things to be otherwise. And he thinks this is so important. This is very close to the argument that also Mary Flanagan, which we saw before, proposes in her critical play book. So by taking a critical stance and playing critically, the original perspectives of the designers come to the fore. They emerge as ways, as I don't know, tools and elements that resist our actions and can be recognized and even subverted. So by playing against the grain, we as players take a critical position and gain the possibility to, in a way, subvert what the designers and the power that they want us to do and want us to accomplish within that world. So if you believe in what we're saying, so that games can be understood as limitations, and perhaps it's a cultural act to act and play and behave, and maybe even believe against those limitations, what are the implications for us as game designers? So it's quite nice to take the perspective of the player saying like, hey, we can treat them as objects of art or objects of, say, incarnated power that we can also rebel against. But what does it mean for us as designers? According to a traditional view on game design and on the profession of the game designer, we tended to look at creating worlds as an act of divine creation. Often, game designers or game creative directors are portrayed as or understood as gods, right? Like Platonic demiurges, those divine creature who turns chaos into cosmos, into order. Those creatures who create deterministically the world and can control the fate of its inhabitants. Now, if we believe, as we saw in the previous passages of this lecture, that the players also have a say in how the game is played and can take possessions and take responsibility over certain behaviors and possibilities within the game, then the vision of the game designer as a god no longer holds very much water, does it? Abandoning a deterministic understanding of virtual worlds and their effects, the figure of the designer, as I said, can no longer be associated with that of a demiurge, a divinity capable of creating worlds and controlling the fate of their inhabitants. Instead, the designer becomes something perhaps closer to a scenographer, somebody who sets up a scene or a situation for players to act in as actors or agents. So the scope and the goal of the game designer at this point should be that of creating believable, compelling, intricate, interesting situations rather than trying to set up fun. At that point, the scene is freely appropriated by the players as actors. Mary Flanagan is a strong supporter of this position, and in her book, she often uses the term play scenario as a synonym for game. Mary Flanagan's position also resonates with that of Brian Upton, who is one of the speakers of this year, and I'm talking about 2019's Game Talks. Brian actually wrote a book called Situational Game Design, in which he talks about the importance of setting up the scene. Interestingly, he doesn't believe that game designers should personally set up a scene, but rather write systems that give rise to interesting scenarios. His position is, although very similar to all the ones that we mentioned until now. And he's going to be talking about it very soon, I think at the end of June. A similar perspective to what we just discussed was proposed by the philosophy of technology, or rather already existed for the past 50 years in the field of philosophy of technology. If we look at games as technologies, or at least technological artifacts, they are, by definition, multi-stable objects, meaning that they are never imposing univocally the ways in which we are supposed to use them and interpret them. Rather, our play is always socially and culturally negotiated. So a technology is never purely inviting one mode of use and is limited to one mode of use, but there's normally many overlapping possibilities that are socially and culturally determined. I'm going to make you an example. If you take games such as Super Smash Bros. Melee, you probably know that this game was meant as a party game. It was not meant to be played fast and mean as a competitive fighting game. However, a malfunction in its physics caused the community, especially the more extreme players, to start incorporating those physical glitches in their playstyles in something that is normally called wave dashing. Wave dashing changed the way in which the game was played competitively and revolutionized the meta of the game. This was not intended by the developers and could not be patched because, well, it was running on the Nintendo GameCube, which had no internet capabilities. Similarly, I don't know if you play Counter-Strike, which is a mod of Half-Life, if I'm not mistaken. In Counter-Strike, the community figured out that there was a possibility to transcend the maximum walking and running speed by using a technique called bunny hopping. By constantly jumping forward, the players would be able to reach speeds that were not intended by the designers. And that revolutionized the way in which the game was played competitively and the ways in which maps were used and traversed. If you're interested in more philosophy of technology, these are the wise words of one of my PhD supervisors, Peter Paul Verbeek. Part of the flexibility that are still present in computer games and the possibility for them to be interpreted and used outside of their intended desire does not only come from, say, our striving for flexibility in game design, but sometimes also comes from our incapability to be able to control this new medium as well as we would like to. I sometimes feel that nowadays designers, despite the great progress we've done in understanding game design and performing game design, are still very much like the inexperienced sorcerer in Fantasia by Disney. Are you familiar with this idea, right? The sorcerer like enchants a broom with the hat of his master and asks the broom to perform work for him. But soon he falls asleep at the wheel and loses control of its technical capabilities or magical capabilities and is quickly overwhelmed by what the computer wants to do and the quirks of the computers or the magic, if you will, and loses control over its creations. I feel that we are always on the verge of losing control of creation because we, in a way, are very much enamored and very much relying on computers to deliver our messages and give rise to our meanings as game designers. Um, I'm not the only one to feel that way. As a matter of fact, I want to report the words of two designers, Merit Kopas and Jason Rohr. You might have heard of them. They are quite visible in the independent games community, which during an interview with the New Statesman, a newspaper, highlighted precisely a very similar point to what I'm just pointing out right now. Let me quote the passage for you. I think that systems have a tendency to get away from us, says Coppas. We intend to portray or produce one thing, but the digital systems we're creating seem to resist or reshape our intents. Even Jason Rohr, with years of programming experience, the game that he was presenting during the interview was his 17th, is currently at 19 if I'm not mistaken, has a long responsibility when things go wrong. He says, as a designer, I'm trying to build the tightest system that I can build. I don't want there to be those system leaks which allow for bizarre readings and involve the procedural rhetorics effectively falling off the rails and going who knows where. So part of the reason why we do not control yet, or the players have that much say in the games that we're currently building in terms of the meaning that emerges from them, is often due to the tendency to make games flexible and adaptive. And normally that is considered to be a good thing, especially great productions. But for indies and small designers, not being able to send a precise message and risking the idea that the players could diverge or misinterpret or even attribute a new meaning to the game is somewhat scary, especially if their livelihood depends on that. And part of the reason why those things can emerge is, again, as I said, maybe we take the computer too much for granted, and maybe we're not fully aware of all the possible ways in which they can malfunction and misrepresent information. This was a long class and I'm very tired, so I'm going to leave you with some homework for now. As I mentioned during the talk, I would like you to read Invisible Walls, Puffy Clouds, and the Unheavenly Words Behind Them. You can find the link here. And also another article by Paolo. I told you this class was going to be Paolo heavy, which is called Multiplicity. And it's about SimCity and ideologies hidden within its code. As part of your homeworks, I would also like you to play 2 independent critical games. One is made by yours truly and is called something something soup something, and another one is called Every Day the Same Dream. Not only I would like you to look at them as games that bring to the fore a particular meaning that they're not fully focused on entertainment alone, or at all, maybe, but they try to convey a message via interactions. And I would like you to focus on, too, how the designers, me and Paolo in this case, in these respective cases, try to, in a way, limit the scope of the world and the possible interactions to make sure that the message is clearly played and similarly played through by every single player. So, as I said, when trying to send a specific message, flexibility and the possibility for players to have power in terms of what the game does and where the game ends is probably not a great idea. I hope these messages and these ideas will be becoming clearer and clearer to you the more we go on in the course, and hopefully the more you play this kind of weird, unexpected, critical, non-game kind of games. I hope you enjoyed the 2 of them, and maybe we can talk about them on Thursday when we're going to meet live. For now, that is all. I hope you enjoyed the class, and well, take care until the next one. Ciao, ciao. Oh, and it almost slipped my mind. Please do not forget that your first graded assignment is due during the next episode, that is episode 4. So write your game concept document, have your friends help you out, have it proofread, test it on your colleagues and peers, try to do all you can to raise the quality of your work and make sure it's responding to the requirements. This is important, please. Pretty please. Ciao.